You'd think a married man with a home, a family, and people around him wouldn't crave solitude, but he does. Not because he's antisocial, not because he stopped caring, but because solitude has become his safest refuge. You see him sitting alone in his garage, lingering in his car before stepping inside, spending extra time tending the yard, reading quietly, and walking slowly. And you wonder, why? The truth is simple and painful. Being alone feels less exhausting than feeling lonely next to someone. If this feels familiar, leave a quiet comment. I find my peace in solitude. When he first married, solitude was the last thing on his mind. He didn't walk into marriage seeking space or silence, he sought companionship. He imagined shared dinners filled with conversation and laughter, late-night talks where nothing felt off-limits, weekends spent side by side, discovering new places, savoring small moments. In those early years, even the simple routines felt intimate. Reading together on the couch, grocery shopping as a team, planning small trips, spontaneous dates, or just lingering in the kitchen while cooking a meal. But over time, something shifted. The house is still full of noise, full of movement, full of routines and obligations, children needing attention, bills needing to be paid, errands needing to be run. From the outside, their life looks vibrant, active, full. But inside, the emotional fabric that once held them close has grown thin. Conversations that used to meander through topics, ideas, and feelings now feel reduced to transactions. Did you pick this up? Can you fix that? Why didn't you take care of this? The warmth that once existed, that casual curiosity about his day, that genuine appreciation for his thoughts, that effortless affection, has quietly faded. At first he tried harder. He asked about her day. He suggested things they could do together. He brought home small surprises, but often his gestures were met with distraction, fatigue, or polite indifference. She was tired, busy, preoccupied, and slowly, so was he. Now, he sits quietly at the table but feels invisible. He shares space in the living room, but feels disconnected. He lies next to her in bed but feels alone. And that's where the deepest irony reveals itself. His longing for solitude isn't about wanting less connection. It's about coping with the absence of real connection. Because when you're sitting next to someone who no longer truly sees you, when your words feel unheard, your presence feels unnoticed, togetherness itself starts to feel lonelier than being alone. In solitude, at least, the emptiness is honest. When he sits in his car a little longer before coming into the house, when he volunteers for errands that take him away from home, when he retreats to a quiet corner of the house, it's not because he doesn't care. It's because solitude demands nothing from him. No explanations, no careful word choice, no walking on eggshells. In solitude, he can simply be. Not judged, not criticized, not ignored, just present. And so solitude becomes a refuge not from his partner as a person, but from the dynamic that marriage has quietly become. A place where connection once nourished him, now drains him. A place where love once felt spontaneous, now feels routine or absent. That's why his craving for solitude is not rejection. It's self-preservation. Because at least when he's truly alone, he doesn't have to feel the sting of being unseen while sitting right next to someone who once promised to see him most clearly. It's not that he stopped wanting closeness, it's that closeness has stopped feeling safe. And this is the cruel paradox so many married men experience but rarely speak about. The house is full, the calendar is full, the life appears full, but his heart, his emotional landscape, it feels empty. So he seeks out solitude, not to isolate, but to rest. Because sometimes, solitude feels more peaceful than sharing a space where he no longer feels truly welcome. There's a quiet but painful realization many married men come to over time. Her presence is no longer enough. In the early years, her being there sitting across from him, curled up beside him, walking next to him felt rich with meaning. It wasn't about proximity, it was about connection. Even silence felt warm because it was shared in a spirit of closeness. A simple glance could convey understanding. A casual touch could speak volumes. Her presence felt like comfort, like home itself. But somewhere along the way, that comfort changed. Now, even when she's physically near, seated beside him at dinner, lying next to him at night, standing in the same kitchen, the atmosphere feels empty. It's not that they fight more. It's not even that there's overt resentment. It's the erosion of emotional connection that's hard to name but impossible to ignore. She's there but distracted. Her eyes are often on her phone, her thoughts somewhere else. Her tone carries impatience more than curiosity. The easy laughter that once flowed now feels rare, replaced by sighs or short replies. In conversation, her responses have grown perfunctory. Oh, okay. Yeah. He notices how she seems to be present in body, but absent in spirit. How even shared spaces feel like they each occupy separate worlds now. At first, he made excuses for both of them. We're tired. Life is busy. The stress will pass. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, he felt it deepen. Her presence no longer fills the void he feels inside. Because presence, he's learned, isn't just about being in the same room, it's about attention. It's about care. It's about being noticed, regarded, appreciated. Her presence used to nourish him. Her questions, her interest, her warmth, these things made him feel alive, valuable, desired. Now, those moments are few and far between. He finds himself noticing how often they sit together in silence, not because the silence is comfortable, but because there's nothing left they seem to want to say. He feels lonelier sitting next to her than he ever did sitting alone. And that's the hardest part to explain even to himself. It's not that he stopped loving her. It's not that he no longer values their life together. It's that her presence no longer means what it once did. Instead of comfort, it reminds him of how far they've drifted. Instead of ease, it reminds him of effort. Effort required just to maintain surface harmony. And so, he begins to crave true solitude, because solitude at least feels honest. When he's alone in the garage, or reading in a quiet room, or walking by himself, there's no pretense. No need to pretend closeness. No subtle reminders of disconnection. In solitude, the void isn't highlighted. It simply exists. But sitting next to her, sharing a couch or a bed, that void feels larger than life. More present. More painful. Because he can't help but remember when it felt different. When her gaze lit up upon seeing him. When her attention felt easy and effortless. When simply being together was enough, more than enough. Now, her presence feels like a reminder of absence. And so, paradoxically, he chooses solitude not because he stopped wanting companionship, but because her companionship no longer makes him feel less alone. It's a heartbreaking realization, one he rarely says out loud, but it shapes his days nonetheless. There's a distinction many people fail to recognize, a distinction married men quietly live with every day. The difference between being alone and feeling lonely next to someone. Being alone is simply the absence of company. It can be chosen. It can feel restful, peaceful, restorative. Loneliness, however, is not defined by the absence of people. The absence of connection defines it. And nowhere is that loneliness felt more sharply than when you're sitting next to the very person who once knew you best, but now seems unable or unwilling to truly see you. In the early years of their relationship, aloneness and loneliness were almost unimaginable. Her presence brought ease, comfort, and warmth. Even quiet evenings spent side by side in silence felt fulfilling because they were connected, emotionally attuned, curious about each other, attentive to small details. But slowly, subtly, that connection began to erode. Now he finds himself sitting beside her, watching television they barely discuss, eating meals with conversations limited to schedules and tasks, going through the motions of partnership without the spirit of partnership. And here's what makes that so painful. When he's actually alone, truly alone, at least the emptiness is honest. He knows he's by himself. He accepts it. He can read a book, think his thoughts, enjoy the stillness without pretending to be connected to anyone else. But when he's sitting next to her, physically close yet emotionally distant, the contrast becomes inescapable. He feels lonelier in that proximity than he ever does in true solitude. Loneliness next to someone is a different kind of ache. It's a silence that feels heavier because it sits between two people who once shared everything. It's a glance that no longer lingers. It's a conversation that no longer seeks depth, but only skims the surface, if it happens at all. It's a hug that feels mechanical, a kiss that feels routine, and over time, this kind of loneliness begins to chip away at his sense of worth. He asks himself quiet question late at night. Why am I still here, if I feel this alone? Would I feel less lonely living by myself? Is it worse to feel isolated in a marriage than it is to simply be alone in life? These are the questions that haunt many married men, questions they almost never voice, but carry deep inside. He notices how his loneliness grows more profound when they share a space, but not an emotional bond. He notices how being near her now highlights not closeness, but distance. This kind of loneliness is exhausting because it requires a performance. He's expected to act present, to engage politely, to respond appropriately, while internally feeling empty. He's expected to be physically there while emotionally withering. It's a kind of quiet betrayal, not because anyone intends harm, but because the intimacy that once made that proximity meaningful has faded. And that's why solitude feels like relief. When he's alone, there's no performance, no mask, no unspoken expectation to pretend everything's fine. When he's alone, he can simply exist without that silent comparison between what was and what now is. So even though he's married, even though he shares a house, a table, a bed, his loneliest moments are often the ones when she's sitting right beside him. And that's what drives the craving for solitude. Not a rejection of connection itself, but a rejection of feeling lonelier in company than he does in genuine aloneness. This distinction between being alone and feeling lonely next to someone is one of the deepest, most painful realizations a man can have. And it's one he almost never speaks aloud. For many married men, solitude is misunderstood. From the outside, it may look like withdrawal. A man tinkering alone in the garage, spending long hours gardening, lingering on a walk longer than necessary, choosing the quiet of a book or headphones over the presence of family in the next room. To others, it may seem like distance, detachment, even indifference. But inside, for the man who craves this solitude, it is none of those things. It is peace. Solitude becomes a sanctuary, a place where expectations fall away, where he doesn't have to perform, explain, or justify. In solitude, he can breathe without waiting for a sigh in response. He can think without interruption. He can simply be, not as a husband fulfilling a role or a father meeting demands, but as himself. This craving for solitude is not a rejection of family or marriage. It is a rejection of exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly negotiating moods. The exhaustion of filtering words to avoid conflict. The exhaustion of walking through familiar spaces where he no longer feels welcome as a full emotional presence. In solitude, no one critiques his tone of voice. No one interrupts his thoughts mid-sentence. No one measures his worth by how many tasks he's completed that day. It is in solitude that he finds a brief return to dignity, because while marriage was supposed to be a place where he could feel accepted fully, flaws, dreams, quirks and all, it has quietly become a place of constant self-editing. So the garage becomes his refuge. The quiet corner of the yard becomes his retreat. Even running errands alone feels like freedom, a chance to drive without being questioned, to think without being corrected. And this is the paradox. He doesn't crave solitude because he's given up on connection. He craves solitude because connection has become so tiring, so hollow, so transactional. In solitude, he is not invisible. He is simply alone, and that, at least, feels honest. There is no pretense, not performance, just space. Space to remember who he was before the exhaustion set in. Space to reconnect, even fleetingly, with the man who once felt curious, light-hearted, expressive. This is what many people fail to understand. His solitude is not about escaping love, it's about escaping depletion. In the quiet, he can finally set down the invisible burdens. The resentment that he can't speak aloud. The grief over conversations that never quite happen. The sadness of living beside someone who no longer seems to notice. Even the small rituals of solitude feel sacred. Cleaning tools, organizing a drawer, sipping coffee slowly, without commentary or interruption. In these moments, he rediscovers control not over anyone else, but over his own internal peace. And so solitude becomes a place where he can find clarity. It's not a solution. It's not healing, but it is relief. Relief from the noise that isn't loud. Relief from the silence that isn't peaceful. Relief from being physically present, but emotionally drained. That's why many married men quietly carve out these spaces for themselves, not because they don't care, but because it's the only place left where they can care for themselves. In solitude, there is no one to disappoint, no one to defend against, no one to adjust for, just quiet, and in that quiet, finally, peace. This craving for solitude, this quiet withdrawal isn't harmless. It may look peaceful from the outside. A man sitting in silence, tending his garden, tinkering with tools, staying late at work, or finding reasons to stay outside a little longer. It might seem calm, even content. But inside, this withdrawal signals something deeper, the slow retreat of his heart from the relationship. He's not just carving out quiet moments for himself. He's protecting what little emotional energy he has left. When a man starts preferring solitude over the company of his partner, it reflects a shift in the balance of the relationship, a subtle but significant movement away from connection and towards self-preservation. At first, this might seem benign. He just needs space. He's decompressing after work. He's always enjoyed his hobbies. But beneath those appearances lies a quiet truth. His solitude isn't about relaxation, it's about survival, because being together no longer feels restorative. It feels depleting. He starts asking himself questions he never voiced before. Why do I feel lighter when I'm alone than when I'm sitting next to her? Why does being in the same room with her feel more exhausting than spending an entire day by myself? And the more he experiences that contrast, the more he withdraws, not out of spite, but because solitude has become the only place where he can breathe without effort. But this withdrawal comes at a cost that both partners often fail to recognize until it's too late. The connection that once held them close begins to fray, not because of a fight, not because of betrayal, but because of absence, the absence of real, nourishing emotional exchange. Over time, their life together becomes filled with shared logistics, but not shared intimacy. Schedules are coordinated, chores are done, birthdays are remembered, but underneath it all, there's a hollowness, a lack of genuine curiosity, appreciation, warmth. She may begin to notice his distance. Why doesn't he talk as much anymore? Why does he spend so much time alone? Why does he seem so quiet, so reserved, so unavailable? But when she asks, he often doesn't know how to explain it, because what he's feeling isn't easy to articulate. It's not about a single argument or a specific grievance. It's about accumulation, the slow drip of years in which his voice was dismissed, his efforts went unnoticed, his needs were reframed as selfish, his presence was taken for granted. His withdrawal is the symptom of that accumulation. And once a man learns that solitude feels safer than company, it's hard to undo. The home becomes a place where he performs, not where he connects. The marriage becomes a structure he maintains, not a relationship he feels alive in. The greatest cost of this emotional withdrawal is that it hollows out the very foundation of the relationship. It replaces intimacy with civility, warmth with routine, conversation with silence, and eventually, both partners wake up to a marriage that looks intact from the outside, but feels empty from within. That's why this craving for solitude matters so much. It's not a phase. It's not a harmless preference. It's a quiet signal that something essential has been lost, that emotional safety, appreciation, and connection have eroded to the point where withdrawal feels like the only refuge. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to repair. Because a man who finds peace in solitude rather than in his marriage begins to slowly detach emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually. And sometimes, by the time either partner notices what's happened, the gap has become too wide to bridge. If you recognize yourself in this, if you've felt more peaceful in solitude than in company, if you've sat quietly in your own home, surrounded by family, but longed simply to be alone, you're not alone in feeling this way. This craving for solitude isn't about rejecting love or relationship. It's about self-preservation. It's about creating space where you can finally exhale. But it's also a warning sign, a quiet reminder that something vital has been lost. That connection has thinned. That companionship has become performance. That loneliness in togetherness is quietly replacing intimacy. If this resonates with you, leave a quiet comment below. I find my peace in solitude. Because acknowledging this truth gently, honestly, is the first step back toward rediscovering connection, whether that means healing the relationship or simply reclaiming yourself.